In the year 180 AD, northern tribes crossed a stone wall in what is now Northumberland, England, and cut down a Roman general, along with every soldier under his command. 73 miles of stone and ditches and watchtowers, manned by roughly 9,000 armed men, existed for the sole purpose of preventing exactly that. And none of it worked. Rome responded by sending a general named Ulpius Marcellus, a man whose fanatical discipline struck the historian Cassius Dio as worth writing about. Marcellus drove the tribes back and restored order within 4 years. The wall held after that for a while. But if you had been standing on that wall the night the tribes came through, your odds of surviving would have matched your odds of enjoying the next 25 years stationed there. Which is to say, they were terrible. This is the story of what it actually meant to serve on Hadrian's wall, and not the version with gleaming armor and golden eagles. This is the version with intestinal parasites, 40% pay deductions, and the very real chance that your own comrades would club you to death if you dozed off during a night watch. The first thing you need to understand is that you are not, technically, a legionary, and that distinction matters more than almost every film about this period bothers to acknowledge. 15,000 legionaries drawn from Legio II Augusta, Legio VI Victrix, and Legio XX Valeria Victrix hauled stone, dug ditches, and raised mile castles beginning in AD 122 under direct orders from Emperor Hadrian himself. Once construction wrapped up, those legions moved on to other assignments. The soldiers who actually manned the wall, but year after freezing year, were auxiliaries, non-citizen troops pulled from every far-flung corner of the empire. You might be a Tungrian from Belgium, a Batavian from the Rhine Delta, or a Dacian from what we now call Romania. And then there were the ones who truly deserve sympathy. The Syrian archers from the city of Hama on the banks of the Orontes River, where the average temperature runs about 30 degrees warmer than northern England in January. What those Syrians arrived to guard stretched across a landscape of genuinely intimidating scale. 80 Roman miles separated Segedunum at Wallsend on the River Tyne from Maia at Bonus on Solway, and the wall originally rose about 15 Roman feet, roughly 4.5 meters, and starting at a broad gauge of 10 Roman feet before the engineers narrowed it mid-construction down to 8. East of the river earthing, the builders used dressed stone with a rubble and clay core bonded by lime mortar, while the western section went up first in turf blocks and only later received stone replacement under Hadrian and again under Severus. 80 mile castles marked the line at intervals of 1 Roman mile, and 2 observation turrets stood between each pair, placing a watchtower every 493 meters along the entire frontier. Between 14 and 17 forts straddled or sat against the wall itself, and the whole structure perched behind a V-shaped northern ditch that measured 9 meters wide and 3 to 4 meters deep, is with a berm of sharpened stake pits called sippi, planted between the ditch and the wall face to slow anyone trying to cross. Running south of the wall sat something found nowhere else on any Roman frontier, the vallum. This massive earthwork consisted of a flat-bottomed ditch 6 meters wide and 3 deep, flanked by 2 mounds each 6 meters across and 2 meters high, with 9-meter berms on either side, creating a military exclusion zone roughly 36 meters wide. Only 16 causewayed crossings pierced it, all at forts. Slipping through this frontier without authorization required serious commitment. The cohors I Hamiorum Sagittariorum, The first cohort of Hamian archers garrisoned the fort at Carveran from AD 122 onward, leaving behind altars dedicated to a Syrian goddess called Virgo Caelestis. Not nothing survives of their opinion on the local weather, but the climate data fills in the blanks without much effort. Northumberland collects between 800 and 1,000 millimeters of rain annually. The central section of the wall follows the Wyn Sill, an exposed dolerite ridge where westerly winds arrive with the kind of commitment usually reserved for personal vendettas, and mean annual temperatures hover between 7 and 9 degrees Celsius. That temperature range held during what climatologists call the Roman warm period, a phase of relatively mild conditions across northern Europe. Mild, though, carries a lot of weight in that sentence. A Syrian archer standing on the Wyn Sill in February would have reached for a different word entirely. What we know, soldiers complained about the conditions because their actual mail survived. Over 750 thin wooden writing tablets lay preserved in the anaerobic mud near the fort of Vindolanda, kept intact by waterlogging, and they represent the oldest handwritten Latin documents anywhere in Britain, spanning roughly AD 85 to 130. Buried among the military reports and supply inventories sits tablet 346, a letter accompanying a care package that contained pairs of socks, 2 pairs of sandals, and 2 pairs of underpants. This was the Roman frontier, the edge of the known world, and the most pressing supply concern involved clean underwear. Even more urgency fills tablet 628, where a man named Masklus writes to his commanding officer with words that translate, more or less, to, "My fellow soldiers have no beer. Now please order some to be sent." Nothing about that letter reads like a casual request. Masklus sounds like a man staring into the abyss and finding it insufficiently alcoholic. Tablet 343 documents a different species of misery. A man named Octavius writes to a colleague named Candidus about a commercial shipment, explaining partway through that he would have already traveled to collect the goods, except that he refused to injure the animals, while the roads were bad. That phrase, "while the roads are bad," survives as the earliest contemporary complaint about road conditions anywhere in Roman Britain. Even the infrastructure Rome built its reputation on could not escape a Northumbrian winter without someone putting a grievance in writing. Cold and damp, though, ranked well below the things that could actually end you. What you ate, what you earned, and how little of your earnings you ever touched paint a darker picture. Mutton and beef dominated the wall diet, supplemented with pork, chicken, and whatever the surrounding terrain provided. Vindolanda shopping lists catalogue wheat, barley, pork fat, ham, venison, eggs, oysters, beans, apples, olives, olive oil, wine, vinegar, fish sauce, salt, pepper, and Celtic beer, and tablet 302 records a single order for 20 chickens, somewhere between 1 and 200 eggs, and 8 sextarii of fish sauce. That sounds almost civilized until you realize the order covered an entire garrison and not a private table. Hadrian himself reportedly shared his soldiers' field rations of bacon fat, cheese, and posca, a sour vinegar drink that passed for hydration in the Roman military, though whether solidarity or publicity motivated that gesture remains an open question. Under Domitian, around AD 84, legionary base pay sat at 300 denarii per year, distributed in 3 installments on the 1st of January, May, and September. Auxiliaries earned roughly 5/6 of that, landing around 250 denarii. and those figures represent gross pay before deductions touched them. The deductions tell a quietly devastating story. Rations, boots and socks, hay and fodder for cavalry horses, clothing, and a contribution to the Standards Fund all came straight out of your earnings. That Standards Fund operated as both a unit savings account and a burial club, managed by the unit signifer, the standard bearer. Layered on top of everything came a mandatory Saturnalia contribution, because even on the frozen edge of empire, you chipped in for the holiday party. 40% of gross pay vanished through these routine deductions, and extreme cases pushed the total toward 3/4. Whatever fraction survived went into a deposit account you could not touch until discharge. Discharge waited 25 years down the line. Enlist at 20, which most recruits did, and you served until 45. That arrangement does not qualify as a career so much as a life sentence with a pension attached. The pension itself amounted to citizenship. 25 years of fighting for Rome, bleeding for Rome, freezing for Rome, and swallowing Rome's fish sauce earned an auxiliary, a bronze military diploma granting citizenship, the legal right to marry, and citizenship for his children. Our legionaries collected 3,000 denarii in cash on top of their diplomas. Auxiliaries collected nothing extra, just the bronze and the legal recognition that they existed as people. Most ended up settling in the Vicus, outside their fort, marrying a local woman, and spending the rest of their lives within walking distance of the wall they had guarded for a quarter century. Between enlistment and that distant discharge, daily existence centered on the contubernium, a unit of 8 men who shared paired rooms in the barracks, a front room for equipment and a rear room for sleeping. 10 of these rooms housed 1 century of 80 men. Hypercaust heating and piped water existed only in the commander's house and the bathhouse, which meant ordinary soldiers kept warm with portable braziers in cramped quarters, shared with 7 other men and all their gear. Communal latrines at housesteads, the best preserved in Britain, flushed with running water and included a channel for rinsing the communal sponge on a stick that served in place of anything resembling toilet paper. Over at Chester's, the bathhouse survives in exceptional condition, and at Vindolanda, the bathkeeper bore the name Vitalis, recorded in Tablet 155. Training never paused, not even on a static frontier. Vegetius records that Roman soldiers covered 20 Roman miles, roughly 30 kilometers, in 5 summer hours at the standard military pace, while carrying about 20 kilograms of gear plus armor that pushed the total load past 27 kilograms. Practice swords and wicker shields weighed double what the real equipment did, and soldiers who underperformed received barley rations instead of wheat, a demotion that carried deep humiliation. All of which leads to a question about survival that deserves a closer look. Life expectancy at birth across the Roman Empire hovered around 22 to 25 years, a number shaped almost entirely by catastrophic infant mortality. Reaching age 20, old enough to enlist, pushed conditional life expectancy up to roughly 40 or 45. Out of every 100 soldiers who enlisted at 20, the historian Walter Scheidel calculated that about 60 would still be breathing at 44. That leaves a 33% attrition rate across the full length of a service term, and the number reflects only disease, accidents, and the baseline hazard of existing in the 2nd century, with no combat factored in at all. And that brings us to what happened when the wall actually broke, which is where the real horror begins. North of the wall lived a shifting mix of tribal groups: the Caledonii, the Selgovii, the Novantii, and eventually the people Romans labeled the Picti, meaning the painted ones, a term first recorded in AD 297 by the panegyrist Eumenius. None of them resembled the barbarian hordes of Hollywood imagination. Across most of the wall's 300-year operational life, the genuine threat came from cattle raids, kidnapping for the slave trade, and banditry. The wall functioned less as a battlefield and more as a 73-mile surveillance tool, a customs checkpoint staffed by very aggressive border guards. Every few decades, that equilibrium collapsed. AD 180 brought the incursion Cassius Dio recorded, when tribes breached the wall and wiped out a general with his entire command. Destruction layers at Holtonchesters, Rudchester, and Corbridge correspond to that date, and Emperor Commodus, not history's most competent ruler, sent Ulpius Marcellus north to restore order. Between these crises came the strange interlude of the Antonine Wall, a turf fortification raised 60 miles further north across the Fourth Clyde Isthmus under Antoninus Pius in AD 142. That secondary wall lasted only about 20 years before Rome pulled back south. And the Military Way road connecting the forts on Hadrian's Wall dates from that return period around the AD 160s. 16 years after the AD 180 crisis, Governor Clodius Albinus decided the imperial throne suited him better than Britain, and dragged most of the island's army to Gaul to fight Septimius Severus. Albinus lost at the Battle of Lugdunum on February 19th, AD 197, and while the army fought overseas, the wall crumbled. Governor Virius Lupus, left with almost no troops, resorted to paying off the northern Maetae tribe to stop raiding, which amounts to the Roman Empire handing protection money to the people on the other side of its own wall. Severus traveled to Britain himself in AD 208 with roughly 40,000 troops and rebuilt the wall so thoroughly that later writers including Bede, Gildas, and Eutropius wrongly credited him with constructing it from scratch. His campaigns drove deep into Caledonia, and Cassius Dio preserves his instructions to the soldiers, as a quotation from Homer's Iliad, commanding them to let no one escape destruction, not even the babe in the womb of the mother. February 4th, AD 211, brought his death at York, and according to Dio, his final words to his sons boiled down to 3 instructions: be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men. Those sons abandoned everything north of the wall almost immediately. The single worst crisis struck in AD 367, an event historians call the Barbarica Conspiratio, the barbarian conspiracy. Ammianus Marcellinus describes a coordinated simultaneous assault by Picts from the north, Scotti from Ireland, Atacotti from the Western Islands, and Saxons arriving by sea. That combined attack killed the Count of the Saxon shore and left the Dux Britanniarum, the military commander of the northern frontier, either besieged or captured by parts of the wall. Garrison appear to have mutinied, and a 2025 Cambridge study using tree ring analysis tied the crisis to a severe drought spanning AD 364 through 366, which crushed rainfall to as low as 29 millimeters during the growing season, and likely triggered the famine conditions that drove the attacks. Count Theodosius, father of the future emperor, restored order between 368 and 369 with fresh field units. The pattern, though, had locked into place. Hold, break, patch, hold again, each cycle executed with a little less conviction than the last, until the early 5th century, when Rome simply stopped sending instructions. Combat, for all its drama, remained the exception across those 3 centuries. What actually stood the best chance of killing you on Hadrian's wall carried no weapon at all, because it lived inside your intestines. 50 sediment samples from a 3rd century latrine drain at Vindolanda yielded roundworm and whipworm eggs in 28% of cases, along with the first confirmed identification of the parasite Giardia duodenalis anywhere in Roman Britain, according to a 2025 parasitology study. Between 10 and 40% of people across the Roman world carried intestinal worms, and this particular evidence came from a fort that had running water, stone-flushed latrines, and a functioning bathhouse. Tablet 154 from Vindolanda preserves a strength report for the first cohort of Tungrians, recording 752 men and 6 centurions, of whom 15 appeared as sick, 6 as wounded, and 10 as afflicted with lipitudo, or conjunctivitis, aggravated by smoke from indoor braziers and unrelenting damp. Rome engineered the most advanced sanitation system the ancient world ever produced, and its soldiers still hosted parasites. That tells you everything about what engineering can and cannot do when it runs up against the problem of being a human body in the 2nd century. Every major fort maintained a valetudinarium, a dedicated military hospital, and Vindolanda staffed its facility with a medicus and trained orderlies. Dysentery, typhoid, respiratory infections, tuberculosis, and chronic arthritis filled those beds year after year, all of them endemic, and all of them largely untreatable with the medicine available. Soldiers survived these diseases, many of them did, but the illnesses wore a body down across decades in a way that a clean blade wound never could. That slow erosion found a fitting companion in Roman military discipline. Falling asleep on watch triggered a punishment called fustuarium. A tribune touched the condemned man with a cudgel, and then every soldier in the camp joined in beating or stoning him. Polybius, who documented the procedure in careful detail, noted with characteristic Roman understatement that the camp dispatched the man on the spot in most cases. Survivors faced permanent exile, and Roman law forbade their families from offering them shelter. Polybius wrapped up his account by observing that the extreme severity of the penalty kept the night watches scrupulously maintained, and one imagines he had that right. Decimation, the execution of every 10th man in a unit deemed cowardly, belonged to the Roman tradition as well, but had grown rare by the 2nd century. Lesser penalties ran from fines and flogging through demotion and barley rations, which carried deep shame, all the way to dishonorable discharge, a sentence that stripped an auxiliary of everything including his path to citizenship. 24 years of obedient service erased by a single violation. Tablet 344 from Vindolanda preserves a civilian's written plea to an officer, begging him not to allow an innocent man to have been beaten with rods. How that petition turned out remains a mystery. The fact that someone scratched it onto a thin strip of wood that ended up in a drainage ditch suggests the answer did not favor the man holding the bruises. And none of that should overshadow the fact that the wall also sustained something resembling a small civilization. Each fort supported a vicus, a civilian settlement that clustered outside the military walls, packed with taverns, shops, and families. Geophysical surveys at housesteads revealed a community of possibly 600 to 700 residents, complete with shophouses and one building that archaeologists have diplomatically labeled the Murder House, named for the two bodies discovered beneath its clay floor, one of which still had a sword tip embedded in the ribs. Women and children lived inside the forts themselves, even during the official ban on military marriage that held until Septimius Severus lifted it in AD 197. Women's shoes, children's shoes, hairpins, jewelry, and wooden toy swords all turned up inside rank-and-file barracks at Vindolanda, some beneath floors dated to around AD 120. Over at Burdoswald, the tribune's infant son, Aurelius Concordius, received a tombstone marking his death at 1 year and 5 days old. Religion on the wall mirrored the diversity of the garrison itself. A temple to Mithras at Karobura, constructed around AD 200 and destroyed around 350, survives as the best preserved Mithraeum in Britain. Coventina's well, also at Karobura, yielded over 13,000 coins, along with altars, jewelry, and bronze masks dedicated to a local water goddess. At Burdoswald, 23 altars to Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus, stand as records of the annual vows sworn by successive commanding officers, one per year, each one a small act of bureaucratic piety stacked in stone. Officers gravitated toward Mithras and Jupiter Dolichaenos, while Celtic deities like Coventina, Belatucadrus, and Cosidius drew the rank and file. Tablet 291 preserves something quieter than any altar and far more human. Claudia Severa wrote to Sulpicia Lepidina, the wife of fort commander Flavius Cerialis, inviting her to a birthday party on the 11th of September. A scribe penned the body of the letter, but the closing came in Claudia's own handwriting, and it reads, "I shall expect you, sister. Farewell, sister, my dearest soul." That postscript ranks among the earliest surviving examples of Latin written by a woman anywhere in the Roman world, and it also stands as the most human artifact the entire frontier ever produced. A birthday invitation inked onto a sliver of wood and buried in mud for 1900 years. But occupying the opposite end of the emotional spectrum sits Tablet 164, a staff officer's memo assessing British fighting techniques. The officer refers to the locals as Britun Cooley, a sneering diminutive that translates roughly to wretched little Britons. That memo reads like the work of a man who is very far from home, very cold, and entirely finished pretending to care about diplomacy. Hadrian's Wall assembled one of the most cosmopolitan communities the ancient world ever saw. Syrian archers garrisoned Carvoron, while Dacians held Burdoswald. Batavians and Tungrians rotated through Vindolanda and Housesteads. Asturian cavalry from Spain rode out of Chesters, and North African Berbers manned Berg by Sands as the first recorded African community in Britain. At South Shields, a Palmyran trader named Barates buried his British freedwoman wife, Regina, and her tombstone carries inscriptions in both Latin and Palmyran Aramaic, a Syrian mourning a Briton in 2 languages on the banks of the River Tyne. That captures the reality of Hadrian's Wall better than any single account. Not one story, but 1,000, drawn from every edge of an empire and deposited in the same reign. Continuous occupation of the wall lasted close to 300 years. The latest Roman coins recovered along its length date between AD 403 and 406, and in 410, Emperor Honorius reportedly sent a letter instructing the cities of Britain to see to their own defense. Whether that letter ever arrived remains debated. What nobody debates is that Rome stopped paying the garrison. At Oswald, as archaeologist Tony Wilmot uncovered something that rewrites the final chapter of this story entirely. Above the fort's stone granaries sat a sequence of crude timber halls, post-Roman wooden structures showing that the fort commander, or someone filling that role, kept occupying the site well into the 5th and possibly 6th centuries. The last Roman officer on Hadrian's wall never left. He simply stopped being Roman and became a local warlord, governing from the ruins of an empire that had forgotten he existed. Which brings all of this back to you. You are 20 years old, and you have just signed up, or been signed up, for 25 years of service on the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. Those years will consist of standing watch on a stone wall in the rain, eating mutton and barley, cool surrendering 40% of your earnings for the privilege, sharing a room with 7 other men and a brazier that gives you conjunctivitis, treating your intestinal parasites with whatever the fort medicus can scrape together, and knowing that a single moment of drowsiness on night watch means your comrades will club you to death at sunrise. Roughly 2 out of every 3 soldiers who enlist alongside you will survive to age 45, and if you land in that majority, you will collect a bronze diploma granting you citizenship. You will probably settle in the vicus outside your fort, marry a local woman, and live out your remaining years within walking distance of the wall you spent a quarter century guarding. Syria will never see you again, and neither will Spain, or the Rhine Delta, or Dacia, or wherever you came from before the empire decided this frozen ridge belonged to you instead. Vegetius once wrote that whoever wishes for peace must prepare for war. The soldiers on Hadrian's wall prepared for war every single day across 3 centuries, and what they mostly received in return amounted to rain, parasites, and a beer shortage. That, more than any battle or barbarian conspiracy, is what would have finished you off. Not the drama, not the glory, just the ordinary, grinding, relentless mundanity of empire, carried out in wet socks on a stone wall at the edge of everything.